What I'm going to do today is, as Tom said, I'm going to talk about U.S.-China tech competition. I'm going to talk about how we got here, and in particular, what shifted with both countries, that they both began to see science and tech competition as increasingly important to the competition between the two of them. I'll talk a little bit about what we're seeing and how that competition is playing out. And then I'll end with some kind of speculative thoughts about how we might think about, could there be a winner in this competition? Or to put it another way, who loses less from this competition? So to how we got here, I think Tom hinted at that there were probably no two countries that benefited more from the globalization of science and technology than the United States and China. China, of course, starting in '78, came out of wanting to reform a science and technology system that was based on the Soviets, and knew that it had already missed a wave of technological innovation and wanted to ensure that it didn't miss the next wave. So it began reforming the domestic S&T system, but also increasingly relying on outside sources of technology, outside money and outside people and ideas. Those outside influences really had a dramatic impact on Chinese innovation and really helped the Chinese move up the value chain very, very quickly. On the US side, the US innovation system has benefited also immensely from the access to people and ideas. We've been hearing for decades about the weaknesses in science and education, math, training at the high school level. And one of the ways the United States managed to build a kind of a detour around that problem was to import that talent. Places like Stanford and MIT and every other major university in the United States has really been able to exploit talent from China, India, and other places. The impact of Chinese and Indian immigrants on the Valley, of course, has been well talked about, and the role that they've played on entrepreneurship and innovation. So both countries benefited immensely from this globalization of science and technology. And around the same time, both countries began having serious doubts about it. And I do want to stress that this was both countries. We tend to frame it as the Trump administration reacting to China, but China itself had also began to think about, in particular, its role in the global economy. Chinese policymakers were unhappy and remain unhappy about being factory to the world, right? Energy intensive, labor intensive, polluting industries was not where it wanted to be stuck. It wanted to move up the value chain, and it was increasingly worried about dependence on foreign suppliers for critical technologies. This has been a long-standing worry of the Chinese leadership, and this certainly focused in the 80s and 90s, and a worry about this dependence. And in 2006, China introduced the mid to long-term program on science and technology. It introduced the idea of indigenous innovation. It sets metrics for China becoming a science power and then a technology power. It sets metrics for reducing dependence on foreign technology. And so the Chinese also began to think about how they fit into this global system. The other major shock to the Chinese system was the Snowden Revelations. Right? So the revelations from the NSA contractor Edward Snowden, showing the ability of the US to exploit technology platforms. China had long assumed there were backdoors in US products that provided the NSA and US intelligence agencies access to networks in China. And so once Snowden basically reinforced that belief, they began thinking about how do you reduce that dependence, especially in critical information technologies in IT, and how do you began pushing foreign suppliers out, replacing them with domestic producers. So Snowden, the mid to long-term plan, and then I think the Made in China 2025 continues this idea that these new technology sectors tend to be zero-sum, that the first mover gains humongous advantages, that there are massive network effects, and the countries that control those technologies are the ones that are going to dominate these important sectors. So a very zero-sum idea about technology and technology competition, I think, became very prominent among many Chinese policymakers and Chinese analysts. On the US side, we had an earlier debate about the rise of China at the end of the 2000s, so around 2007, when the National Academies produced a report called The Gathering Storm, which talked about this globalization of science and the rise of China and India in particular as science competitors. But even in that report, the idea that China was going to compete on cutting edge technology seemed to be several decades away. There was, I think, still a pretty robust debate in the United States about, was China truly innovative? Could it become truly innovative with a top-down system that seemed to be based on copying technology from the United States and reproducing it inside of China? But that has clearly changed. Right? The debate of the United States now, especially on a series of emerging technologies, AI, 5G, quantum, synthetic biology, there is a real sense that China is close to, if not at the cutting edge, especially in certain areas of AI. So a shift in the competitive capabilities of China. Second, of course, under the Trump administration, a focus on great power competition and science and technology being part of that. So parallel to this shift in Chinese thinkers about zero-sum competition, on the US side, a real focus on international relations being increasingly zero-sum and defined by great power competition. And then finally, a sense that the openness of US science technology was being exploited, that the Chinese had for a long time been exploiting both the openness of American universities, American networks, other places, and you needed to start thinking about how do you stop that flow of technology. Now, again, this is not only the Trump administration. If you can see some of these thoughts starting to percolate through at the end of the Obama administration. In particular, in a report that PCAST did, the President's Council on Science and Technology Advice on semiconductors. That report at the end of Obama administration starts talking about China's mergers and acquisitions in semiconductors, taking advantage of market forces to move up the value chain on semiconductors and what the US would need to do. That report comes down in the conclusion that we need to run faster, but it was certainly sensitive to the idea that China was acquiring technologies both illegally and legally. And then the report that came out of the Defense Innovation Unit, experimental at the time, now DIU, which looked at Chinese investment in the Valley, in particular at a range of emerging technologies, quantum and AI. So at the end of the Obama administration, you were clearly beginning to see this worry about openness and China moving up the value chain. So on both sides, I would say a real ideational shift and an increasing tendency to see conflicting interest in the technology side. So that's, I think, what happened and how we got here. What we've seen on the US side is a real attempt to try to stop the flow of technology out of the United States and to slow Chinese growth. So the flow of technology, the Trump administration is focused on a number of areas. The first was on foreign investment in the United States, so reform of the CFIUS process, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, expanding CFIUS review to a broader range of technologies, and looking at different types of purchases, including minority shares, reform of the export control laws, so broadening and looking at emerging technologies. And so we're seeing now that process of how do you define what these technologies are, especially in machine learning and AI. How can we draw the line between military use and civilian use? A prolonged campaign against Huawei, the Chinese telecom company, first focused on making sure Huawei was not in US networks. So first blocking contracts with DoD and preventing Huawei phones on defense bases, then blocking access to government procurement, now thinking about how do you pull Huawei out of telecoms in rural and third and fourth tier markets, and then using the entities and sanctions list to try and cripple Huawei for a series of sanctions violations, IP theft, and other alleged violations of US law, and then a prolonged campaign to try and convince US allies and friends not to use Huawei in the build out on 5G. The administration's messaging on this has not been particularly effective. It has been essentially a kind of two-step process. First, arguing that 5G is a different type of security threat, that you can't deal with the 5G security threat the way you dealt with the fourth and third generations, which was primarily to try and segregate periphery networks from core networks, do inspections of code, do inspections of equipment. The US has consistently argued that that's not possible to do in 5G, that there's too much data at the peripheries in the base stations, and that because there is so much software involved and the software is constantly being updated, that you can't really do code check because you check it one day, the next day it's updated, you're still going to have that problem of backdoor. So 5G in and of itself is an almost unsecurable kind of network, which means you have to rely on the provider, and you can't rely on Huawei. You can't, that is the second step of the process. You can't rely on Huawei for a number of reasons. One, they point to this history of IP theft and other sanctions violations. They point to the 2017 National Intelligence Law, which in some readings seems to suggest that any Chinese company or entity has to serve in an espionage role and would not be able to report it. They point to buggy software and equipment, although that is true across all 5G manufacturers. And in some cases, they've pointed to backdoors that were not immediately closed. This messaging has not been effective for most of our partners, except for Australia, Japan, and New Zealand. I think it hasn't been particularly effective for a number of reasons. I think first, for most countries, the threat is to get spied on by the US or China or both. And they have no belief that using Huawei or not using Huawei changes that. In fact, they probably believe no matter what they use, they're still going to get spied on by the US or China. And you might as well at least get the cheap product and the good product and roll out in 5G as quickly as possible. So that doesn't seem to be a particularly convincing argument as far as I can tell on the espionage side. The US has also tried to argue that Huawei or the Chinese government could disrupt 5G networks to gain leverage over a country that wasn't doing what it wanted to. I think there are very few countries that are seriously worried about that kind of threat. Perhaps if you can imagine that you'd be involved in a Taiwan Straits crisis or a South China Sea Strait conflict, you could imagine the Chinese exerting that kind of influence. But clearly, China has lots of ways of exerting influence on smaller countries without turning off 5G or Internet of Things devices. Using that type of tool would be a one-time thing. It would totally undermine Chinese technology companies internationally. It's hard for me to imagine why it would use those tools for most cases. Clearly, mixed messaging from the administration itself has not been particularly helpful. So in many cases, after US officials have gone to Europe and talked about what a security risk Huawei is, the president will then tweet that he's willing to do business with anyone. And so reinforces in European partners' minds that this is really an economic competitiveness issue and not a security issue. And then finally, the decision by the British to say, well, we in fact can segregate the risk. We can push it out to the periphery and reduce Huawei's presence both in the sector in the networks overall and in the core, and we can have an adequate level of security. Seriously undermines the US's ability to convince their allies. The final step of the US reaction, Tom mentioned in his introduction, which is broadly I would call out of the Department of Justice, the Cybernet, the China initiative. That includes a cyber component. So we've seen the Department of Justice has started indicting Chinese hackers again for cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property. They've alleged that Chinese hackers were behind the attack on Equifax and behind attacks on IT services and clouds through an operation called Cloud Hopper. And we're seeing a crackdown on academics involved in the Thousand Talents program. So China's effort to lure foreign and Chinese-born expertise back to China. Many of those cases seem to be people that are double dipping, not necessarily involved in espionage, but are taking two salaries, not reporting that salary, and reproducing some of the research that they're doing in the United States in their labs in China. So we're seeing a closer look at those collaborations, who's being transparent about them, and who's reporting on them. So a real attempt on the U.S. side to try and stop the flow of external technology. The final component, which we don't know very much about and is purely speculative, on the cyber side, is also a shift to a more disruptive set of actions. So Cyber Command has talked about persistent engagement and forward defense, which they talk about stopping attacks before they get to U.S. networks. Operating either in what's called gray space, so space between Chinese networks and U.S. networks. The primary leaks about those operations have been focused on Russian influence operations. But before John Bolton left the White House, he did give a talk at one of the DC think tanks and said we are engaged in those types of operations against Chinese hackers as well. And so we don't know what that disruption looks like, and we don't know if it's likely to be more disruptive. On the Chinese side, as I said, China has a long-standing concern for dependence on foreign technology, and it's worried about where it sits in global supply chains. And the primary response, of course, has been Chinese spending on research and development, science and technology. So China went from spending about 1.1% of GDP to close to 2.5%, now spends more than the EU and Japan do on R&D, and depending upon how you measure it, on purchasing power parity or just market exchange, will soon catch the United States. So I don't think we should seriously doubt that the Chinese are spending significant resources. This has been a primary concern, and we've seen a huge focus on these critical emerging technologies. Lots of writing, of course, about the AI strategy inside of China, and on quantum, and the increasing coordination with Chinese tech companies as national champions in this space. The second, I think, tool the Chinese have had is the Belt and Road Initiative and commercial diplomacy. So extending Chinese connections, science and technology diplomacy along the Belt and Road. The Chinese Academy of Science now has agreements and a Belt and Road center inside of it. It is doing more training and setting up research labs along the Belt and Road. The investment in the first wave of the Belt and Road was primarily hardware, so fiber optics, satellite communication, and now we are seeing the expansion out into e-commerce. So Alibaba in Malaysia and other places, fintech in particular, and then smart cities, which also, of course, means surveillance technology. So studies done out of Carnegie and other places show that China tends to be the dominant supplier, not the only supplier, but the dominant supplier of surveillance cameras, artificial intelligence, and other types of surveillance technology along the Belt and Road in other developing areas. Along with this new commercial diplomacy is a focus on international standards and how do you shape those standards. And so both on the Chinese firm side, we've seen a massive expansion of attendance at international standards forum, in particular the role that ZTE and Huawei have played in the 3GPP. But Chinese also at the ITU and the International Electrotechnical Mechanical Commission, number of vice chairs across standards sides there. In reaction to the Trump response, I would say primarily you've seen three things happen in China. The first is doubling down on indigenous innovation. Right, so after the entity list was published and sanctions on ZTE, President Xi Jinping went around and gave a series of speeches to Chinese scientists and engineers and others about the need to hold core technologies in China's hand and to double down on indigenous innovation, particularly in chips. Right, so that is the one area where so China imports more value in chips than it does in oil. And it is a real vulnerability for them. And so we saw Chinese companies, Huawei, Alibaba, Tencent, and others also announcing their own chip initiatives, investing tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars into that, into the chip initiatives. And the government setting aside another $50 billion for semiconductor investments. So doubling down on indigenous innovation. Diversifying the sources of technology. So as money no longer flows to the US and they're worried about CFIUS and other controls, looking at other places in Europe, looking at Israel and some other places, although the US is now trying to convince the EU and Israel to institute investment regimes, but they are being able to tap into some technologies there. And then finally, a dependence and reliance again on the espionage, the cyber-enabled espionage side, making sure that they can have access to technologies that they were cut off from. So let me end with some very speculative thoughts about how we think about who might win, or as I said, who loses less in this competition. And I think there are kind of four variables that maybe that we can think about. The first one, and this is comes out of a theory from Mark Taylor from Georgia Tech, is that states that face security competition can use that to mobilize domestic politics to push forward innovative policies. You can then get domestic coalitions in place that you couldn't get in place to break barriers and I think spend on R&D and other things you couldn't do before. Here, I think the evidence is pretty mixed. So on the US side, I think you're seeing part of that. You're seeing some of that. So we're having a debate about industrial policy in the United States, which we have not had in a long time. When you have people like Senator Rubio out of his Senate committee write a report that basically says that the nature of the challenge from China forces us to start thinking about industrial policy, I think we're in a different place, and you're beginning to see the shift, I think, in domestic policy coalitions. The speech that Attorney General Bill Barr gave 2 weeks ago is another example, right? He started talking about US buying shares or stakes, controlling stakes in Nokia and Ericsson, the only alternatives to Huawei and 5G out there. So I think we're seeing that on the domestic side, but it's pretty splintered because our domestic politics are still truly splintered. And the White House budget is a great example of that. They have put forward increased spending on AI, quantum, and the Defense Department, but cut spending on all other forms of R&D. And so if you were truly mobilizing on this competition, you would expect to see much broader support for much broader range of technologies, as opposed to the Trump administration's fairly narrow focus on a set of technologies that they see as important for national security. So on the domestic side, I think China is much more able to mobilize the resources it needs to continue this competition, and Chinese policy tools, I think, are more applicable and suitable for this competition. The kind of meta problem for the United States, of course, also is that how does the U.S. ensure that it stops the flow of technology without damaging itself, right? Which is I think, the way that the debate has been framed is, of course, you want to make sure that critical technologies are not stolen, that people do not engage in espionage, but you have to do it in a way that ensures the openness of the U.S. innovation system. That balance, I think, is very hard for the United States to get right. Historically, we tend to swing one way or the other, and even though the intelligence agencies and law enforcement gets that rhetoric, if you read the counterintelligence report, if you read the report for the FBI, they all talk about the need to keep the openness of American universities in place, and protect it. But then the rest of it, of course, is all a focus on competing with China. So I think that balance is harder for us to do. So I would weigh on the domestic side, probably China slightly ahead of the U.S. The second, I think, variable that plays a role in this competition, of course, is international partners and international collaboration, right? So as I said, science and technology have been rapidly globalized. There are centers of excellence in all of these things. And part of why the U.S. has been such a dominant system is not because it is the only science and technology power out there. It's because it is the most important node in a network of science and technology collaborations. And so how the U.S. continues to strengthen those, I think, is a real strength for the U.S. Of course, this administration is not particularly interested in alliance relationships or science diplomacy, but I think it is still probably one of the U.S.'s great strengths. I think the longer-term issue for the United States is how Europe positions itself in this space. Increasingly, it is defining itself in opposition both to the United States and China, right? So when the Chinese talk about technological sovereignty these days, they talk about it as sovereignty from Chinese hardware and Chinese hardware and U.S. software, the U.S. platforms. So how do you get those relations right? I think is important. But on the total, I would give that to the United States. International partnerships is still a greater strength. The third variable is the nature of the technology itself. So we're talking tech very, very broadly, but we probably can't really have any sense of the competition unless we break it down by sectors and how those technologies are structured and how innovation tends to happen in those technologies. So is the innovation tend to be incremental? Does it require having a group of scientists working on the problem stay together for decades, something like that's happened in batteries? Or is it going to be more fluid, more collaborative, something that's been happened with more breakthroughs? Here, I think it's probably across the board. So AI seems to be the type of technology that is extremely open, extremely collaborative. We're seeing a huge amount of talent flow, technology flow, and the ability to attract people seems to be a defining nature of it. The chip side of it, of course, the computational side is different. Those technologies are fairly limited. Quantum, at least on the computing side, also seems to be driven by the ability to spend lots and lots of money, keep teams together. So that, I think, really depends on the technology, and I think we'll go across those sectors. The last point that I'll end on with, and I think is the kind of fourth variable in how you think about the competition, is the relationship between the tech community and the government. So Silicon Valley, DC, or however else you want to thumbnail it or shorthand it. And here, I think The interesting thing about this competition is that we tend to frame it as, a top-down versus a bottom-up system, or state-led versus more private sector. Both systems are increasingly dependent on their big technology players, both to drive innovation in the private sector, not only just commercially, but also basic R&D, but also to be at the cutting edge of technologies that feed back into the national defense side. So we see that on the Defense Department being more and more worried about how do you reach those technologies, experimenting with things like the DIU, Defense Innovation Unit, talking about procurement reforms so you can get the technology faster, looking at talent flows, how do you get more people into the DoD who understand the technology. And of course, on the Chinese side, we see civil-military fusion, military-civil fusion, the attempt to bring the private sector closer to the Chinese defense industry base. On this side, the U.S. government has tended to frame increasingly as Chinese tech as being completely hostage to the party. And here, as someone who first saw the tech companies as being completely separate, or very separate from state-owned enterprises, they grew up in sectors that didn't exist, and so they managed to only attract the attention of state planners when they got bigger. We certainly have seen Xi Jinping tightening control through party presence in the companies, through this discussion about buying shares in the companies, through the national intelligence law, and other regulatory things there. But I would suspect that there are still inherent tensions between what the companies want to do when they think about markets, and global markets in particular, and what the party wants to do. Now, it's very hard to find those gaps these days, given the debate inside of China, but I would be very surprised if the party has managed to align all of those interests. On the US side, of course, our divisions are out in the open, and so those are both political, with many of the technology workforces not wanting to work with the government because of working on surveillance on the border, or helping ICE and others. But there's also a different vision of China and how you compete with China. And here I don't really see either side being able to narrow the gap. So I would marginally put that China has the strength right now that the US is still struggling with. Although I think longer term, once we get that into place, that's still going to remain a US competitive strength. So for those of you keeping score at home, that comes out to about 2-2. So in a perfect kind of think tank world, I get to say on the one hand, on the other hand. But I think technology, which had usually been 5th, 6th, 7th on the agenda in the US-China relationship, is going to continue to be, I think, one of the defining issues that structures the relationship, and increasingly is one not just about concerns about national security, but about values as well, and how we think about how that technology is applied, and governance issues.